Welcome to the Midnight Release presents Midnight Reflections with Chase. Today's episode is called Collect Memories, Not Things. Welcome back to our fourth segment of Midnight Reflections. We have done a few of these so far. Just a reminder as to what these episodes are specifically and what they contain. These are these very kind of deep rooted, introspective episodes. I do these solo, so it is just myself, no Austin on these. And, each one has been some kind of very important topic. We've had one for Father's Day. We reflected on very core years of 1998. And, you know, I mentioned that these episodes aren't on a schedule. They just kind of pop up whenever something comes to mind. And something did pop up today that led me to our topic. And, today, kind of the general lay of the land, if you will, is, about collecting memories or moments instead of things. But I say it as a question because of the complexity of that. And, we're going to go through kind of the normal process. We're going to have a conversation and kind of have a narrative around this topic and then a little bit of reflection on that and why it is something that kind of resonated with me specifically today and why it has become the topic for our next midnight reflections. So, that being said, let's go ahead and just kind of get into that concept of collect memories, not things. So, the reason that this has come to mind, first of all, is that years ago I found a photo in a store like IKEA or it was Target or somewhere like that. And it was a picture of a beach scene that said collect I think it said collect moments, not things, but conceptually that's the same thing here. Collect memories, not things. And I at the time I found it very ironic because I very much like had it hanging in a room full of collectibles, full of Funko Pops, full of statues, and all of that. So there was a little bit of irony in it. And at the time, I just kind of chuckled at that concept of the irony. But now, thinking kind of more deeply about it, it's kind of a contradiction, is how I see it. And I think that's because of a couple things, but there's a TV show I'm watching right now called Silo, which if you haven't watched it, it's on Apple TV. It's very good. It's got Rebecca Ferguson in it. Love her. And there's this whole thing about them finding relics, which are items, and they kind of unlock memories, if you will. And that made me think of how contradictory that statement is because things hold memories. And, the memories do matter. When we think from a nostalgic standpoint, family vacations, your first concert, late night gaming sessions that we've talked about, shindigs that I used to have, which we'll be getting into those in a future pod episode. But those sorts of things are very, important. Those memories and those moments that you experience during those are critical. But if the memories and the moments are what matter the most, then why do we keep so many objects connected to those memories? And I'm not just talking about photos or videos, which is definitely something that's more modernized. I think we all millennials can remember a time of a family member with a camera, disposable camera or big video camera on their shoulder. I seem to remember my grandpa, walking around with one of those, took the tapes, and the way cameras evolved. I'm not so much referring to pictures or videos, but actual objects, because objects are kind of like memory anchors, if you will. And, for me, my kind of collectible journey, if you will, kind of started with Pokemon cards. Like that's the first thing that I can remember like actively collecting. And I was young, we're talking 9, 10 years old, and I wasn't someone who played the game per se, like competitively or anything like that. And that's been a topic of other episodes with Austin, but I just collected the cards. And I remember buying packs, cracking packs. Definitely didn't mean then what it does now, but I very much can remember the experience of collecting back then. And I would argue back then is definitely different than now when it comes to cards, because it was just about the joy of, like, I didn't even like sleeve cards back then. Like, that just kind of puts it in perspective. As a kid, you buy a pack and maybe you play the game or maybe not. But it was something that was a lot of fun. Trading cards at school, finding that super rare card in a pack. For me, it was also very much about buying a specific card. And, you know, there's a store, here in town called Comic Book World. Shout out to Comic Book World, where I still go today as an adult, as 36. How old am I? 37. 37. And I play cards at Comic Book World. But the idea of collecting Pokemon cards and the memories associated with these physical items go back to buying the super rare cards at Comic Book World. And the fact that I still go there to this day is something like I still feel a certain kind of way each time I walk in the shop. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to collecting as a kid and as an adult, some people, like Howie, like to retain and hold on to everything, which is outstanding. I can't imagine having access to all of the things I used to collect because of the memories that would be deep rooted in those items. And I do feel that when Howie sends pictures of something he's found or something like that. Me personally, I've gotten rid of all my Pokemon cards. So, but after that, though, I really transitioned and started collecting like movie tickets. Like, I went to the movies a lot as a kid, and I made it a point to keep every single ticket stub. And it wasn't necessarily, for me, it wasn't necessarily keeping those stubs because of like first dates, when I was 13, 14 years old, or a very key movie launch like the Spider Man 2 Midnight with my cousin Biggin. I kept every movie ticket, and it was a physical item that I was able to, because I had them like in a binder or something like that, and I was able to look at these tickets and be taken back to the experience of that particular movie. Now, I did totally have movie tickets from dates and things like that, and those were the memories that took me back to it. Seeing Darkness Falls in theaters, which was a date where I had to have a chaperone, which happened to be Biggin, and that is something I don't have the tickets anymore. Of course, to the point of selling all my Pokemon cards, my movie tickets, I also just like threw away. I didn't understand the importance behind them, but I can still reflect on those moments and memories because of a physical item. Even if I don't have the physical item, it did hold that significance. And, and then VHS tapes, was another big thing. And we'll talk about physical and digital and the hype or debate, I guess is the right word around that right now. But, I got super deep into collecting VHS tapes. Dragon Ball is such a key part of my personality. And I made it a point when I discovered the Dragon Ball Z VHS tapes were available at Suncoast Video in Jefferson Mall. I made it a point to buy those every 2 weeks or every month whenever they released. And of course, it was really cool because they would form like if you lined them up on a shelf and you turned them around, they formed a like synonymous image, which was really cool. And that eventually evolved into like DVD collecting, which I went through DVD collecting experiences several different times. When I worked at GameStop, I bought a lot of TV series and a lot of movies because GameStop always ran like buy two get two frees and things. But really, I didn't get like balls to the wall on collecting of media like that for a while. But aside from media, because I'm going to get to media in a minute, but then you've got like statues and toys. I feel like as a kid, you don't consider the toys you have as collecting per se. At least I didn't, because you played with those toys. Now, again, to Howie, who keeps everything, like he has a lot of nostalgic toys that he still has. And again, when he sends those photos to us, these items, these things kind of bring back a rush of memories when you see them, when you hold them or smell them, depending on what it is. Again, tapping into the senses. It's one thing to collect moments or collect memories, but if you don't have something to bring those memories back, are they really there? I very much see the toys or the action figures, if you will, as collecting once I got older. I got really into Funko Pops. I got really into Funko Pops. And I know a lot of people that have, and I had like 7 or 800 of those, and was making it a point to buy them like every week or every 2 weeks. Same thing with Dragon Ball Z statues. Anyone who's big into the statue collecting game knows that when those first started coming to the US, they were pretty expensive. And when I say expensive, I mean I'm talking when I was a teenager, paying $50 for a statue was a lot. But it got to a point where you could find really high quality statues for 25, $30. So, you know, I basically made it a point where I had a room called the Windu room, which was because my nickname is Chase Windu, that was filled with collectibles, filled with Funko Pops, filled with Dragon Ball Z statues, filled with other statues and toys, Play Arts Kai figures, other just retro action figures like the Power Rangers Zords or anything like that. And it was something that, when I'd walk into that room, again, that's where I had this picture that said collective memories, not things. So there was irony in it. But with each statue or each Funko Pop, there was something connected to it. The Dragon Ball Funkos. I remember wanting Dragon Ball Funkos for so long. And then finally, Funko collaborated with Dragon Ball. And that was such a big deal. And it was around when the resurgence of Dragon Ball Super was happening and all of that. And the statues, for me, it very much was deep rooted in kind of my post employment loyalty to GameStop. I would go in, pre-order statues, and I got to be friends with the people that worked at GameStop, and it turned into a whole thing. With each time statues came out, oh, let's call Chase, and I'd come in and we'd shoot the bull, and there was a lot of memories tied to that. You know, there's the DVDs and Blu-rays, the physical media, if you will. And I went through a couple of different iterations of that. I mentioned earlier, when I worked at GameStop, I collected a bunch, got into some financial troubles, had to sell them all. And then I did get to a point where I went just crazy on Blu-rays. And I was going to Best Buy every week on Tuesday to buy whatever new release it was. People used to laugh, at my peak, I had about 1,200 movies. And everyone would laugh because I had not seen probably half of them. But with each movie, there was a memory attached to it, assuming I had even seen it. But even if I hadn't seen it, like I remember, anyone who knows me knows I'm not a huge fan of dogs. Okay. Now, don't look deeper into that than you have to. Like, oh man, if he doesn't like dogs, that must make him a horrible human. And some people may think I'm a horrible human. But the fact is, I don't think I've ever met a dog who didn't love me. It's just that I don't like dogs. But they had these movies, A Dog's Purpose and A Dog's Journey, I think is what they were called. I bought those movies. And it was always a conversation starter when people would look at my shelf and be like, "Why do you have these? Like this isn't even like your type of movie." Or that Megan Levy movie. I haven't seen that either. With her name escapes me right now, but it was a military movie about a dog. And so again, something physical, but there was a memory related to it. Like I remember buying it because I bought movies every week. There was no other new release except for those, and that's what I bought. And you know, I think these days, like from a space perspective, and there's other variables. Like I don't collect nearly the amount of like physical statues and things like that, or movies anymore. Like I've really just gone solely digital, and I'll get to that. But posters are something that are also kind of very tied to memories, and they're easier to collect because you put them on a wall, or if you sleeve them up and stick them in a box somewhere, you know. And I have a lot of posters that I've acquired over the years from different conventions, and maybe even posters that Howie has created. You know, he's a creative feller, and you know, each of those posters, though they're a physical item, they retain some kind of memory. Most recently, Ellery, my brother-in-law, got me a poster of Patch Adams. And if you listen to the 1998 Reflections episode, when I talk about how significant 1998 was, that movie released in 1998. And Robin Williams is the personification of my grandfather, 100%, especially in that movie. So that's a physical item that's hanging on the wall. But it instantly, by acquiring that, it is like acquiring more memories, essentially. By having that poster to look at, I look at it and it sends me down kind of memory lane. And you know, there's other things people collect, you know, games. You know, I've gone through my physical game collecting phases in my life and console collecting in my life, each which, you know, trigger some kind of memory or nostalgia. You know, now with games, that's a hot topic with the physical and digital, and I'll get into that a little bit. But you know, with emulation, you know, with games, it's not necessarily maybe the physical collecting aspect as much as it is the playing aspect, which is still a thing, that bring those memories kind of back. You know, but you can't help but think of all these different things, and maybe you collect something similar to anything I've rattled off, or maybe you collect things I didn't rattle off. You know, I feel like the older generation had like their precious moments statues. You know, I feel like that was the previous generation's Funko Pops, or those precious moment statues. But even then, by collecting these things, there's generally some kind of memory attached to it. And you know, that is the question. Like, why? Why do we collect things? And you know, I was thinking about it, and I mean, we collect things to preserve pieces of ourselves, you know, and especially if you're someone who's retained things from different eras of your life. Like I said, I beat myself up all the time that I no longer have my old Pokemon cards, or all of my Game Informer magazines back to 2004. You know, I only have them back to like 2013, I think. But it's like a personal museum for the things that you have. You know, we're able to preserve these pieces of ourselves, and it's like each item tells a story, basically, or it's a conversation starter, or something like that. And maybe it's not necessarily for monetary value, but emotional value. And that's coming from someone who's generally not a very emotional person, but and sometimes it may be for monetary value. You know, I'm sure we all remember, all of us millennials remember parents buying TY Beanie Babies and putting them in plexiglass boxes, talking about how much they're going to be worth one day, you know. So, yeah, maybe there's some monetary value in some of it, but that's not what I'm talking about here. You know, I'm talking about the things that we collect because of the emotional value. And you know, the thing is, there's some danger in collecting. I think we're all kind of aware of that, depending on what you get into, whether it's Funko Pops, whether it's collectibles, whether it's physical media, or you know, something like that. You know, or maybe it's something that's for me is more recent, and they hold kind of some different value, but like going to conventions and getting autographs from celebrities. Now, I know I said that I'm not talking about pictures or videos, but when you go to those cons and you meet celebrities, you might get selfies or professional photo ops. And yeah, that's kind of the one exception, you know, to my picture thing, because I don't want to latch on the fact of pictures, because that's like preserving the moment. Yes, it is a physical thing, but I don't necessarily call that a thing. Now, autographs I would call a thing. You know, if you've ever been to conventions, all these things cost money, and sometimes an autograph is much cheaper than a selfie or a photo op. So it may not be a photo where you've captured that moment or that memory, but it's an autograph. You know, I have some autographs from folks that I don't have selfies with. You know, Sonny Strait, voice of Bardock and Krillin. I have an autograph from, but I don't have a photo with. And there's a very staple memory attached to that, because I met Sonny Strait back in like 2004. and then was able to meet him again like 2 years ago. And, so pictures are part of that, but it's not necessarily what I'm referring to. But, the dangers with collecting, you could argue consumerism issues with that. It's very expensive hobbies sometimes when it comes to collecting. And, also if you have a very addictive personality, maybe it's not about, maybe your vice isn't something toxic, or something damaging, drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, but maybe your addiction is in the consumer market. It's buying all of these things. And, FOMO is real, fear of missing out. I have experienced this so many times. That's the whole reason that I bought digital, the movie Obsession, was it was all over my For You page. And FOMO was real. I was like, I don't watch horror movies, but I have to watch this. And that leads to sometimes collecting. There's also the concept of kind of hyperfixation and special interests. When you think of folks who are neurodivergent, you get into something and you go into that thing, and that's the thing. Maybe the items that you collected in a hyperfixation or special interest moment takes you back to that particular moment. Maybe you got into collecting things during a very traumatic time, and maybe you don't want to keep that collection because of the memories tied to it. But I don't think that we should let the bad memories that are tied to things define the thing itself either. Because if you've been through traumatic times and you got hyper fixated on, let's say, pins, I don't know, you can get pins at Hot Topic and all of that. Let's say you had a massive wall of pins and it was a very trying time. I think there are people who put a lot of weight in things despite saying, collect memories and moments instead of things, but they would get rid of a whole collection because of the bad memories attached to it. But I think it's more important to, especially once you've gotten out of those ruts and those bad memories, reflecting back on where you were at that time and where you are now. So again, kind of how the items hold the memory itself. Um, there's also, depending on the kind of space you have, if you get really into collecting, you could, potentially be considered a hoarder, depending on how much stuff you have. I'd like to call Howie a hoarder, but he's a very structured, organized hoarder. And again, I'm hyper jealous that he has so many memories in a box or many boxes for that matter. And there's also some validation in it too when it comes to collecting. But I do, I always want to be respectful of time on these midnight reflection episodes because they are deemed to be shorter. And it makes me think of when Brian and I have conversations and we started off with, hey, long story short, spoiler alert, it's never a short story. But I do want to talk about physical versus digital when it comes to collecting, though. For those who are not actively in kind of a chronically online world or a gaming world, there's this hyper debate right now around games going digital. Sony has announced they're going fully digital in January of 2028. I think it was January, maybe it was April. I don't know why those 2 months jumped out, but there's a lot of debate around actually owning something, whether we're talking movies or games. And with it being digital, you don't actually own it; that you own a license. And I do think, because the whole concept of this reflections is how a physical item holds some kind of memory and that piece of ourself. And again, objects are memory anchors, and that is something I think we'll lose with media becoming more digital. Yes, you'll conceptually have the game and conceptually have the movie that can still have those memories tied to it, but there is something about a case on a shelf, the description on the back. If we go super retro, we're talking about games with the instruction booklets that had character bios and things like that. We're going to lose, not that we've had that for a while, by the way, but we're going to lose that. And, I am someone who succumbed to the convenience of digital. Like I said, I sold off my entire Blu ray collection but I have a lot of those digital. I said I had about 1,200 movies. I probably have 800 of them digital. But and then games, I only do digital. But there is something to be said about this physical versus digital debate and issue right now that your retro game stores are blowing up because people now are wanting to buy up a lot of physical games that are technically available digital right now on different storefronts, but it's because of the memory tied to that case or that artwork or that collector's edition. I didn't even talk about collector's editions of games, but that was definitely a phase of mine too. And I don't know whether we're still going to have those or not, with statues or with art books or anything like that. But the whole thing of physical versus digital, I think there needs to be some legislation put in place before like that becomes a thing. Because for those who don't know, like Sony has lost licensing and literally went into people's digital library and taken movies away from them. I can't imagine opening up my Voodoo library and it going from 600 to 400 because of licensing. Like that's insane. And gaming, it's only happened, I think, once, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. But to the concept of memories and things, yes, playing the game or watching the movie, that is kind of a moment. That is a memory. But the physicality of what goes with that, the case, the booklets, the addition, the steel book for movies. They used to do steelbook Blu-rays. I don't know if they still do. You know, but that's the thing. It's just something that these things are the anchors to the memories that we should collect. But yeah, I mean, let's go ahead and do a little bit of reflection kind of on all this stuff. You know, so yeah, memories and moments are very important. But the things are what help us remember them. And I said that why this popped up was a TV show called Silo on Apple TV, which is true. That is part of what popped this up. But, the thing is, look, people say, and I say people say, I don't know what people, I'm just saying the content that I consume, you see this pop up a lot. People say that like autism and ADHD are significantly more prevalent today than it was back in the day. I hear the same thing about like dementia and Alzheimer's. These were things that weren't necessarily in our parents' day, but are very much today. Now, I am not about to say I agree with the boomer argument around that. No, there's science has advanced, early diagnoses. Like I am not saying agreeing with the folks that say, "Oh, it wasn't back in my." No, that's not what I'm saying. But to that point, with dementia with Alzheimer's specifically, are deterioration of memories, of moments, and how many times have we heard or seen things where physical things are able to allow folks suffering through these ailments to remember these moments and these memories because of certain things. There's a documentary I think on Disney Plus where Chris Hemsworth, his dad, has dementia or Alzheimer's, and they were able to basically set up their childhood home the exact way that it was set up. And there are memories that kind of come back, whether actual memories or like internal, where you can see the expression on his dad's face change. So yes, living in the moment and those memories is important, but these items tell the story of who we were. Maybe it's an old game that got you through a rough year, and when you revisit that game, you remember that rough year. And I don't think that, I already mentioned it with the pen example, but I don't think that the things that have bad memories should be scrapped because of the bad memories. Rather it's about seeing where you were and where you are now. The same thing with a movie. You've watched a movie a hundred times. You may not have a unique memory or moment with each of those hundred viewings, but I bet you do with the first time that you watched it, or maybe when you watched it with a specific person, or something like that. And the trading card stuff, when I talked about Pokemon cards, like, I remember that being such a big deal in my childhood, and we talked about this on the pod. Anime and cards and games, they were not cool back in our day, so there's a lot of bad memories that I have with those. But I don't reflect on the bad memories. I reflect on the joy and the fun that came with trading Pokemon cards. And I'm not worried about the people who flipped my binders or threw my cards all over the playground. I think about the time that I had with friends with that. You know, I had a huge stint in local music, and a lot of band shirts and band clothes. I don't have them anymore, but I'll tell you right now, I wish that I still had the shirts from the local music days. Quentin's band Serene uh, had a bunch of shirts, and I had all those shirts, and I loved those shirts, and I would love to have those for like a shadow box hanging on the wall to remember those moments. I can sit here and say the memory and remember it, but having a physical item, you know, a- it's important. It anchors us to the memory. The thing matters because the memory matters, not really the other way around. So I mean, I guess what I'm saying is maybe that's why we hold on to certain things for decades. It's not because they're worth money, it's not because they're rare. It's because they're proof that a moment happened and that we have memories from those moments. It's a reminder of who we are, where we were, who we shared that moment or those memories with. And, you know, the memories may be the treasure, if you will, but sometimes it's the things that are the map that helps us find them again. So, yeah. Well, anyway, I think we're going to close it out there. And as always, everybody remember that there are some memories worth lining up for, but others you just got to sit down and reflect on.